Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Aatif Rashid's Book Club. I'm Aatif Rashid, and today we're going to be discussing Ursula K. Le Guin's novel, The Dispossessed, from 1974. Now, the full title is actually The Dispossessed, an Ambiguous Utopia. I'm not a big fan of that subtitle. I think the phrase "the dispossessed" is enough. But so I'm going to avoid referring to that subtitle, which I think a little too literal, which I think takes away from the novel's beauty and subtlety. Now, before we get started with The Dispossessed, though, I just want to make a quick announcement. As I said last week, my second novel, Grand Tour, is coming out in the fall, September 29th. It's available for pre-order now. The novel is about a young art history graduate student who travels across Europe in the summer of 2012. And it's about the world of European backpacker hostels and art history and the big questions about the meaning of life. I'll also be doing the audiobook, so be on the lookout for that. And yeah, with that, let's get into The Dispossessed. So this is, I suppose, technically our first science fiction novel that we're discussing on the podcast. Some of you might argue that something like The Picture of Dorian Gray had certain speculative elements, and I think that's fair and that's valid. But this is really the first hard science fiction novel that we're looking at on this podcast. Now, in general, I used to read a lot of science fiction when I was younger, when I was in middle school and high school. More recently, I've moved away from science fiction towards what's called in the publishing industry literary fiction. I've often felt that science fiction sometimes feels, at least for my taste, too abstract, too theoretical, too invested in ideas and concepts, rather than what interests me, characters, emotions, character arcs, etc. However, The Dispossessed really took me by surprise. I was really moved by this novel. Really moved by the story, by the journey that this character undertakes. And it is a pretty philosophically heavy novel that explores themes around anarchism and capitalism and utopia, as the subtitle suggests, and what makes for a utopia, as well as these questions of time and experience. But it does so much more intelligently than I think I had believed. I had heard that this novel was quite didactic, at least that's how it was described to me. Actually, I found it not didactic at all. I thought Le Guin did a marvelous job of presenting the complexities and the nuances of the two societies she depicts in the novel. And even though she clearly comes down in favor of one society over the other, even though there's clearly a correct answer to which of these societies is the better society, and we're going to discuss what that correct answer is. Even though that's the case, I wouldn't say that the novel is didactic. The novel allows its protagonist to reach that conclusion through a character arc. And that's what I think prevents novels from being didactic, is instead of simply having the narrator tell you what the correct answer is, they depict a character arriving at that point through their experience, through the experience that we witness in the novel. And as a result, it doesn't feel didactic because we have gone through that experience with the character. We have reached that conclusion alongside our protagonist. So the central plotline, the central storyline, narrative through line of The Dispossessed, it follows a Shevek, who is our protagonist. He is a physicist, and he is from the planet of Anaris, which is an anarchist and vaguely communist society. And he travels from Anaris to the second planet, the second setting, Uras, which is essentially a variation, though not entirely the same, a variation of our world, a capitalist civilization, essentially. And basically, the novel has two simultaneous timelines. We have one storyline that takes place on Uras, as Shevek is basically integrating himself into this new society. He's kind of a guest of honor, essentially. And, he's a famous physicist who's attempting to solve this great question, this great physics question about time. And that's one plot line, right? His life on Uras. The second timeline, the second plot line, the second half of the novel in all these alternating chapters is basically what we might think of as a flashback. It's the story of his life on Anaris that leads to him deciding to leave, which is the first scene we see, is him leaving Anaris. And so we have these two simultaneous storylines occurring, one of which is essentially a flashback. But I think what Le Guin does really well, and we're going to talk about that in terms of the structure, is that it's not really a flashback. It's wrong to call it a flashback, because when we think of flashbacks, right, structurally, in terms of writing, flashbacks are usually there to serve the main storyline, right? We have flashbacks at key moments that provide us with insight and information and details that help us understand our protagonist better. That's not really what is happening here. I think it's far more sophisticated than that. The storyline that's taking place on Anaris, what we think of as the flashback or the past, is just as essential and just as important as the storyline taking place on Uras. And more to the point, I think, one of the central themes of this novel is this question of time, right? That's one of the big theoretical concepts that Shevek, our physicist protagonist, is attempting to understand and grapple with. And so I think the choice to present two parallel storylines that occur in different time periods, one in the past and one in the present, is a reflection of the novel's central thesis about time, which we will get to, and essentially Shevek's central thesis about time. These two timelines, I would argue, are kind of thematically interacting with one another. And what she does so intelligently is that, the emotional climactic point in the storyline set on Anaris happens right around the same time as the emotional climactic point as the storyline set on Uras. And in fact, they seem to inform each other in some way. And so we're going to look at this as we talk about the structure. But I think the structure is really intelligent here, and that's one of the most sophisticated things about this novel. The way she bounces back and forth between these two storylines, it's incredibly intelligent in the way it's structured. We're not going to get to all the subtleties and details of it. I think just the experience of reading it, you'll see all of these correspondences between the two sides. Let's begin, though, with the first chapter, which I think introduces the very famous image that is a recurring motif throughout this novel, the wall. It introduces a wall, and specifically it is describing a wall on Anaris, on the planet of Anaris. But the wall becomes an essential symbol for the difference between these two societies, but also so much more, right? A kind of symbolic wall that we all seem to carry inside of us. And the arc that Shevek goes through over the course of the novel is essentially to break down these walls. There are lots of walls, literal and metaphoric, in this novel that Shevek works to break down. And so, it's a perfect opening that really just sets up exactly what this novel is about. So let's just look at the opening chapter here. There was a wall. It did not look important. It was built of uncut rocks, roughly mortared. An adult could look right over it, and even a child could climb it. Where it crossed the roadway, instead of having a gate, it degenerated into mere geometry, a line, an idea of boundary. But the idea was real. It was important. For 7 generations, there had been nothing in the world more important than that wall. Like all walls, it was ambiguous, two-faced. What was inside it and what was outside it depended upon which side of it you were on. Looked at from one side, the wall enclosed a barren 60-acre field called the Port of Anaris. On the field, there were a couple of large gantry cranes, a rocket pad, 3 warehouses, a truck garage, and a dormitory. The dormitory looked durable, grimy, and mournful. It had no gardens, no children. Plainly, nobody lived there, or was even meant to stay there long. It was, in fact, a quarantine. The wall shut in not only the landing field, but also the ships that came down out of space, and the men that came on the ships, and the worlds they came from, and the rest of the universe. It enclosed the universe, leaving Anaris outside, free. Looked at from the other side, the wall enclosed Anaris. The whole planet was inside it, a great prison camp, cut off from other worlds and other men in quarantine. So it's a wonderful opening section here. Let's just kind of break down, let's analyze the passage here. She begins by emphasizing that the wall actually isn't really a great physical barrier. An adult could look right over it, a child could climb over it, right? It just degenerates into geometry at certain points. It's just an idea, she says, an idea of boundary. So she begins by really emphasizing that the wall is not physical. The wall is not a physical reality, but it is still a reality. It is real in the abstract sense. I think this is also Ursula K. Le Guin's way of telling us that, yes, this is a novel about physical barriers, but it is really a novel about more abstract barriers, intellectual barriers, emotional barriers, ideological barriers, right? She wants us to think of walls and barriers in a more abstract rather than literal way. She's also, I think, signaling to us. I remember, as I always say, novels teach us how to read them in their opening. So she's teaching us to say, you need to think on the level of ideas for this novel. This is going to be a novel of ideas, just as the wall is an idea. Just because it's not a physical barrier doesn't mean the wall does not have significance or importance as a barrier. She also goes on to sort of emphasize the difference between the two sides. What is each side of the wall? She emphasizes that depending on which side you're standing on, the wall looks like it encloses something different, right? So, on one side is the port of Anaris, and this port is relatively barren, as she said. It doesn't have much, but it obviously has a rocket pad and implicitly a connection to the rest of space, to the rest of the world. And from this perspective, essentially, Anaris is outside and free. The word free is important because I think right away she wants us to ask the question, well, are they really free? It sounds like they're actually not, right? It sounds like they're the ones who are separated from the rest of the world, from space, from a connection to the rest of the universe. So are they really free? And certainly from the other perspective, from the other side, it says Anaris looks like a prison camp, cut off from other worlds and other men. So that, I think, is the central question, the central thematic question of the novel. Is Anaris free or not? It's basically the central question of the idea of anarchism, right? Because as we're going to see, the way Anaris is depicted, the way this society is depicted is they don't really feel free. I think I don't want to necessarily focus too much on the obvious communist allegory here, the obvious connection to communism. Yes, this novel was written in the 1970s, so obviously the Soviet Union would have been on people's minds, and certainly this question of two societies divided by a wall. I mean, there are very obvious parallels to the Berlin Wall. I think, though, Le Guin's novel is much more sophisticated and intelligent than just a simple allegory for the Cold War. I think it's so much more than that, and so much more interesting than that. So I'm going to try and avoid making those connections and references, and try and read the society of Anaris on its own terms. And based on the way she depicts it, it's very nuanced. On the one hand, the people of this society don't always feel free. And certainly, Shevek, as we're going to see, does not feel free, which is one of the reasons he feels like he needs to leave. Because he feels like his ideas, his scientific ideas, there's no place for them in this world. And if he really wants to push the boundaries of science, he needs to go to Uras. He needs to go out to the capitalist world. At the same time, as we're going to see when we read certain sections, there is a profound and intense beauty to life on Anaris, as Ursula K. Le Guin depicts it. And when I was reading this, I was very moved by the depictions of the sort of cold and harsh beauty that these characters experience on Anaris. It's not an easy place to live. It's arid, it's a very harsh climate, and yet I believe that Le Guin is making the argument that despite all of this, it is still home for Shevek. It is still the place that he returns to. It's impossible to read this novel and not feel that Anaris, despite the difficulty of life there, that society is beautiful. That society is free. That's the society that Le Guin is ultimately saying is the right choice. Whereas Uras, despite being very beautiful, it ultimately has this kind of moral rot to it. And we're going to look at some passages where Le Guin very clearly articulates that. But I think what's important is that Le Guin doesn't simply say it, right? It's not simply a didactic idea that Anaris is better than Uras. Instead, she presents it through the experience of our protagonist, of Shevek, right? It's his journey that allows him to reach this point. And that's what I want to focus on in my analysis here, is Shevek's journey. Like I said, there's so many deep philosophical ideas about this book that we could discuss. And lots has been written, lots of people have written great analyses online of the really complex and deep ideas about time and simultaneity and ideology, etc., and the abstract stuff and mathematics and all the things Le Guin is trying to say with this novel. But as we know from this podcast, I'm primarily interested in character arc, in character transformation. And that's one of the most profoundly beautiful things in this novel is Shevek's character arc, Shevek's character transformation. He begins the novel essentially by leaving Anaris, by fleeing Anaris. And Anaris is sort of presented as limited, right? As limited. We see in the depictions of Anaris, especially in the first half, how limited he feels on Anaris. And he feels that, his ideas around physics don't have a place here, and that he needs to leave and go to Uras to really reach a greater intellectual height and level. And that's why he leaves. But ultimately, as we're going to see, he ends up feeling this profound alienation on Uras. He ends up seeing the true ugliness underneath the external beauty of Uras, of the capitalist system. And he begins to turn his feelings back to Anaris. And as I said earlier, it's through the simultaneous timelines that we see this. It's almost like the memories of the earlier timeline, in particular of his relationship to Takvir, who we're going to talk about a lot, his soulmate. His relationship to her is really what anchors him to Anaris and ultimately draws him back. And that's part of that beautiful arc that he experiences. And I think by the end, I certainly felt this when I read it, and I think a lot of people feel this, is that you end up feeling that Anaris is a profoundly beautiful place despite not being externally beautiful. That deep down, underneath the harsh conditions, life on Anaris has a purity and a freedom, a true freedom that it doesn't have on Uras. Remember, that was the question she asked at the beginning. Are the people of Anaris truly free? And I believe the point she reaches at the end, and again, it's not in a didactic way, right? But the point she reaches at the end through Shevek's character transformation is that, yes, they are truly free. And we will look at the way in which they're free and how they achieve that freedom. I want to jump ahead now. So, the first part of the novel, really the first half of the novel, is primarily, right, these two parallel storylines of Shevek on Anaris and Shevek on Uras. And we see his life on each of these societies, and the point is to create this contrast between the two societies. We have two timelines here, right? We have Shevek when he's young and sort of his life as he's growing up, and then Shevek in the present on Uras as he tries to kind of find his place and settle into the society, right? He's kind of a guest of honor on Uras, right? He's there to work on these grand scientific ideas. But the point is that we see this contrast between the two worlds. I want to really focus, though, on the character of Takvir, who we meet in the midpoint of the novel, because I believe that she really represents the heart and soul of the novel. She is the emotional foundation who Shevek returns to, the emotional foundation that anchors him to the planet of Anaris, and his relationship with her, I believe, it's profoundly beautiful. It's also the emotional anchor that is going to draw him back at the end of the novel. So let's look first at the moment they meet. So this is in chapter 6, and it's on page 165, so it's right around the middle of the novel, right before the middle. And so structurally, it's kind of a midpoint, him meeting Takver. And that makes sense because, narratives, in traditional narrative structure, the midpoint is often when a character experiences some significant twist, so some significant turn that shifts things for them, that maybe opens up new perspectives, makes them realize something that they didn't understand before. And that's what he's going to experience here when he meets Takver. He's going to understand and see Anaris in a new way because of her. So let's look at this moment, right? The context is he is going hiking with some friends, and he meets her, among other people. She had the laugh of a person who likes to eat well, a big, childish gape. She was tall and rather thin, with round arms and broad hips. She was not very pretty. Her face was swarthy, intelligent, and cheerful. In her eyes there was a darkness, not the opacity of bright, dark eyes, but a quality of depth, almost like deep, black, fine ash, very soft. So that's our first description of Takver when he first sees her. I want to really hone in on that because I think it's through that description that Le Guin very clearly associates Takver with Anaris and really connects her to the planet. Notice that first description, right? It's emphasized that she's not very pretty. Now, that's not a very nice thing to say about the woman you love, the woman you were going to have children with, your soulmate. But it's not really an insult here, because remember, what does prettiness signify in this novel? Uras is pretty. As Shevek is going to learn, Uras is very pretty, very beautiful. There's a beauty to Uras that Anaris does not have, but as he learns, as we're going to see, that beauty is masking an inner moral rot, an inner rot that makes it truly ugly. So external prettiness is not the value that matters to Le Guin or to Shevek. Anaris is not pretty, but ultimately Anaris is home. Anaris is free, the answer that he's looking for. The other details, her face was swarthy, intelligent, and cheerful. Swarthy, obviously just kind of a word for darker skin, but intelligent and cheerful are really interesting. Intelligence, obviously, right? Anaris, we see a lot of very intelligent characters, people who are all engaged in very specialized tasks, crafts, projects, etc., right? It requires a really sophisticated intelligence to make a life on this harsh planet, on this harsh place, in this harsh setting, in this arid ecosystem. And so intelligence is a key quality associated with Anaris, and then cheerfulness. And that's the most unexpected, because you wonder, again, life on Anaris, as we've seen, is difficult and brutal. And yet, as we see through Takvar, it can be cheerful. There can be a happiness there. And Takvar represents this cheerfulness. She is connected to the planet. She is connected to Anaris. Her job, as we learn later, right, she is a biologist. She studies fish. Her job is to try and find a way for this marine life to thrive in this arid ecosystem. So she's pretty directly connected to the planet, right, to ecology, biology, life on the planet itself. Le Guin is clearly associating her in this passage and with others with Anaris itself. The very next line, in her eyes there was a darkness, not the opacity of bright dark eyes, but a quality of depth, almost like deep black fine ash, very soft. Right, so the darkness in Takvar is not a negative darkness. It is a quality of depth, just like Anaris, right? Anaris has a depth to it. Beneath the aridness, beneath the harshness, there is a true beauty. The same thing with Takvar. In this description of her, in this first physical description of her, we see that depth. And so it's just a wonderful, beautiful way of describing one of the characters who I think is maybe one of the most important. She doesn't have the same arc that someone like Shevek has. She might not even have as many scenes as some of the other characters, but I believe she is the emotional core of the novel. Her relationship with Shevek provides him with this grounding, with this connection to Anaris, and it is the reason at the end that he comes back. As we're going to see, it is Takver and his feelings for her and his relationship with her that draws him back. If we jump ahead, there's another passage I want to look at. So they sort of talk and they have this conversation, and they talk specifically about sex. On Anaris, right, in this society, people have sex pretty openly and freely. We see Shevek engaging in relationships with other women before this, right? But at the same time, among some of the characters, sex means that these relationships are temporary. We see this in particular with Shevek's mother, Rulag, right? Rulag kind of represents the darker side of life on Anaris, because Rulag essentially rejects her family and chooses the collective, right? She does not feel loyalty to her partner, to her son. She chooses instead this life, this collective life. And so you might think, based on that and based on some of the other temporary liaisons that we see characters engage in, that there is no room for love on Anaris. That you have sexual pleasure and that people take sexual pleasure, but that there's no room for those deeper feelings. But then we see this conversation, this exchange with Takver. And so let's look at this moment. What's wrong with pleasure, Takver? Why don't you want it? Nothing's wrong with it, and I do want it. Only I don't need it. And if I take what I don't need, I'll never get to what I do need. What is it you need? She looked down at the ground, scratching the surface of a rock outcrop with her fingernail. She said nothing. She leaned forward to pick a sprig of moonthorn, but did not take it, merely touched it, felt the furred stem and fragile leaf. Shevek saw in the tension of her movements that she was trying with all her strength to contain or restrain a storm of emotion so that she could speak. When she did, it was in a low voice and a little roughly. I need the bond, she said, the real one, body and mind, and all the years of life. Nothing else. Nothing less. So it's such a beautiful, I think, so moving and so profound. Le Guin is saying that there is room for love on Anaris. There is room for love because a character like Takvar, she desires something deeper than just pleasure, than just the temporary liaisons. She wants this deeper bond. And look at the sort of way this scene is written. He asks her, what is it you need? And she doesn't immediately reply. Instead, she looks down at the ground and scratches the surface of a rock outcrop with her fingernail. Right? It's as if Le Guin wants to make sure we understand that Takver is connected with the planet. Right? She's connected with the ground. She's connected with the soil. That's the emphasis, right? She scratches the rock. It's almost like before she can answer, she needs to touch the ground. She needs to feel that connection with Anaris. I mean, this is something we're going to see in all of these scenes between Takvar and Shevek. Their love story is always placed in the context of the physical world of Anaris. Le Guin will always, and we're going to look at some other beautiful passages, Le Guin will always describe in these very lyrical, beautiful moments the wonder of Anaris whenever Shevek and Takver are together, because she wants us to understand that their love story is connected to the planet, connected to Anaris, that it cannot exist outside of this context, that it requires this context. It's almost like if we think of Anaris, right, it's an arid ecosystem. What grows on an arid ecosystem? What grows in such arid conditions? This kind of love grows in such arid conditions. I think she's implicitly saying, and we see this when on Uras, right, Shevek has this pretty problematic and dark relationship with this other woman, clearly a contrast with Takver, right? This type of pure and true and free love can only exist on Anaris. And that's why for Le Guin, it's so important to consistently connect Takver with the planet. Takver is not a character who has an arc in the same way Shevek does. But she's incredibly important because she is the anchor. She's the emotional anchor that connects him to this place. And let's look at his reaction to what she says here when she says, the real one. I want the real bond, body and mind in all the years of life. What is his response? If we look at the next few lines, she glanced up at him with defiance. It might have been hatred. Joy was rising mysteriously in him, like the sound and smell of the running water rising through the darkness. He had a feeling of unlimitedness, of clarity, total clarity, as if he had been set free. Behind Takver's head, the sky was brightening with moonrise. The far peaks floated clear and silver. So notice the language there. He feels joy rising in him, and immediately she connects that joy to sensory detail, to the sound and smell of running water through the darkness. His emotions are connected to the landscape of Anaris. It's so beautifully done the way she consistently does it. His feelings are connected to Anaris, in this case, to running water. And then he feels this sense of unlimitedness, of clarity, and as if he has been set free. Remember, at the very beginning, that was the question she asked in the opening passage. Are the people of Anaris free? And that's kind of been this question throughout this whole first half. It feels like no. It feels like actually they're not free because he's struggling on Anaris. His ideas as a physicist people aren't receptive to them. There are several different incidents throughout his childhood which suggest that Anaris is not as free as people think it is, or as it might claim to be. But here, he discovers actual freedom, true freedom. How does he discover it? Through his love for Takver, through this profound and deep emotional connection to Takver. He feels this genuine freedom. And right after this line, look at the line that comes next. He looks behind Takvar's head and sees the sky brightening with moonrise, the far peaks floating clear and silver. Again, the feeling he has is almost immediately connected to the physical world. In this case, the moon rising behind her head, so even the physical world is connected to her. Quite literally, her head is the moon, right? She is the moon. And the far peaks are floating clear and silver, right? We see the mountains with this beautiful silver clarity. I mean, it's such a beautiful image, and this is why I felt so moved by their love story. I mean, I'm surprised to say this is one of the most moving love stories that I've seen depicted in a novel. And I think part of it is the function that the love story has in the context of Shevek's character arc. This is not a struggle, this love story. There's no tension or conflict between him and Takver. They meet and they fall in love almost immediately, right? This is 3 pages after they've met. The point is not conflict or tension with Takver. Takver is his soulmate, and he knows it almost immediately. He feels it almost immediately. The conflict is this enough to keep him here or to bring him back at the end? And the answer is yes. And it's so profound and moving when we see him coming back to her at the end. We're going to look at those scenes towards the end, the kind of, 2 timelines and how they kind of affect each other thematically to sort of build his character arc and to transform him. And so I think the way she accomplishes this, the way Le Guin accomplishes this as a writer, it's this beautiful connection to sensory detail when possible, but it's also this confidence in her theme. She knows what Takver is supposed to represent. I always have this discussion with in my classes sometimes. Should you outline your novels? There are a lot of writers who I think give misguided advice to students to not outline. And I sort of understand that because there's a fantasy. We're going to see how this connects to Le Guin in a second, but there's a fantasy when we write that it should all just come naturally to us and intuitively to us. And if we outline, we are sort of violating the sacred intuition of the writer. We should just trust our guts. I don't think you could write a character like Takvar, the way Le Guin writes her here, without an outline, because she clearly understands Takvar's function in the story. That's the essence. That's what I'm talking about. Characters have functions in stories. You can't just write a character and sort of trust your intuition to have it lead somewhere important. You have to know as you write what the significance of this character is in the novel. Takver, she is not our protagonist. We're almost never going to be inside her head. There's one little moment which we're going to look at towards the end. She is there for Shevek's storyline. She is there as the emotional anchor for his storyline. But Le Guin knows that, and Le Guin does not try and make Takver anything more than she needs to be. There is a confidence and purposefulness in the way Le Guin writes this character, and that's part of where the beauty and the magic of these moments come from. We're going to see more of Takver and Shevek's relationship because, again, I think this emotional core that is created here is going to have this effect on him in the climactic point of the novel. But let's look at, so the next big scene I want to look at is a little bit further ahead. This next section perhaps is the most famous scene in the novel. This is the party scene. This is maybe the most frequently quoted point, I think. And when you read this passage in context, I mean, you'll feel it. You'll be like, oh yeah, this is the moment. This is the key line. This line is everything. This line encapsulates the whole novel in a single passage, right? In a single speech. And the context is basically right. He has grown weary of Uras. He no longer sees it as beautiful. It's part of Shevek's transformation. He's starting to question why he came here. He's starting to question the capitalist values of this society. And he gets very drunk at this party. And this is sort of what prompts this big outcry from him, this big speech. And so it's prompted by this really interesting question. So this is a little more than halfway through the novel, but it is such an emotional pivot for Shevek. You know, up to this point, he has been pretty ambivalent towards Anaris. Obviously, he left Anaris, partly because he felt dissatisfied with Anaris. And in this moment, he sort of realizes that actually he loves Anaris. That's what he's going to realize in this moment. This is in chapter 7. And so again, when we think of the structure, this happens after we had chapter 6 in which he meets Takver. Why is that important? You know, even though these are two different timelines, essentially two different Sheveks, right? Two different characters almost. I think Le Guin does this interesting mirroring, right? Where a revelation in one section, right, in the past will influence a revelation in the next section. It's part of the theory of time and simultaneity, which is Shevek's own research. We're not going to spend too much time talking about Shevek's research regarding time, but that is obviously the big through line here, and I think it's as I've said, it's mirrored in the structure. But it makes sense that first we see the flashback, first we see the past in which he meets Takvar and feels this profound sense of freedom with her. Then, in the next chapter, he realizes, or the future version of him on Uras realizes that he doesn't like it here and that he misses Anaris. And there is a true freedom on Anaris that does not exist here. So even though these are two different timelines, they seem to thematically affect each other. That's the genius of the way she structures this. But let's look at this scene. This is on page 214. So one of the people at the party asks him, "Tell us about Anaris. What's it really like? Is it so wonderful there, really?" He was sitting on the arm of the chair, and Via was curled up on the hassock at his knees, erect and supple, her soft breasts staring at him with their blind eyes, her face smiling, complacent, flushed. So Via is the other love interest, right? His love interest on Uras, who's clearly a foil and a contrast to emotionally grounded and ideal Takver. Via, by contrast, is all sexuality and all sensuality. And then he has this response. So let's read his response. Something dark turned over in Shevek's mind, darkening everything. Remember, darkness is key because Takver was described as dark, right? The darkness, but her darkness had a depth to it, like volcanic ash, like soil. It was complex, it was nuanced, it was profound. This is an ugly darkness that he feels now, a totally different type of darkness. His mouth was dry. He finished the glassful the waiter had just poured him. "I don't know," he said. His tongue felt half paralyzed. "No, it is not wonderful. It is an ugly world, not like this one. Anaris is all dusty and dry hills, all meager, all dry. And the people aren't beautiful. They have big hands and feet, like me and the waiter there, but not big bellies. They get very dirty and take baths together. Nobody here does that. The towns are very small and dull. They are dreary. No palaces. Life is dull and hard work. You can't always have what you want, or even what you need, because there isn't enough. You, Urasti, have enough. Enough air, enough rain, grass, oceans, food, music, buildings, factories, machines, books, clothes, history. You are rich. You own. We are poor. We lack. You have. We do not have. Everything is beautiful here. Only not the faces. Now, here is the pivot. We're going to keep reading, but I want to pause here. This is the pivot of his big speech. So the first half, he's basically describing Anaris. He's saying, yeah, it's dusty and dry. It is ugly. Now, we know this already. We have experienced life on Anaris. We understand it's dusty, it's ugly, it's dry. He's not telling us anything new. And we know that he feels this way. Partly this is why he left Anaris, because he felt this way. So that is also not new. Right, the things that he emphasizes, the people aren't beautiful. Remember, he literally said that about Takvar a chapter ago, right, in the past storyline. He said, yeah, Takvar is not pretty. They have big hands and feet, right? Takvar was also described in that way. The towns are very small and dull. They are dreary. No palaces. So now he's going to say all the things, and we've seen this in the past few chapters. Uras has all of these things that Anaris does not have. Uras has air and rain and grass and oceans and food and music and buildings, etc. All of these aspects of civilization that make life beautiful and easy and comfortable, right? And he emphasizes that. He says, you are rich and you own things. We are poor. We lack, right? The word own is key there because property ownership is the defining characteristic of Uras, right? Private property ownership. Whereas on Anaris, right, they live in this collective communal society. They do not own things ideologically, but also literally, right? Because their world is poor. But what does he say? Everything is beautiful on Uras except the faces. And now we get the big pivot of the scene. On Anaris, nothing is beautiful, nothing but the faces. The other faces, the men and women. We have nothing but that, nothing but each other. Who is he thinking of here, by the way? Who do we think he's thinking of? He's obviously thinking of Takver, because we just saw him meet Takver in the previous chapter in the past, and we sort of can implicitly know that that's who he's thinking of here. That's the beautiful face he's thinking of, because that's his soulmate. So you see, she represents Anaris, and now in this pivotal moment of transformation for him, he's implicitly thinking of her. Here you see the jewels. There you see the eyes. And in the eyes you see the splendor of the human spirit. Because our men and women are free. Possessing nothing, they are free. And you, the possessors, are possessed. You are all in jail, each alone, solitary, with a heap of what he owns. You live in prison, die in prison. It is all I can see in your eyes. The wall, the wall. Just remarkable. When I read that passage, I felt a shiver in my spine. There's a very famous passage from Nabokov where he talks about the shiver in your spine when you read something truly magnificent, truly sublime. He talks about this in the context of Bleak House by Charles Dickens. This very famous passage from Nabokov, and I always think about that because I have felt that shiver many times when I read. Maybe not many, many times, but enough times. And I know that when I feel it, I know that what I am reading is incredible. And I felt it in this moment. I felt just a deep, profound shiver running through me. It's that shiver of aesthetic appreciation, that shiver of sublime aesthetic appreciation, when you know you have just read something remarkable that hits at everything. And this passage did that for me, and it is when I knew that this was a masterpiece. That this novel was one of the great works of the 20th century. Truly a remarkable passage because it builds to, obviously it builds to the phrase, the wall, the wall. And the novel began with the wall. We read the opening passage where he talks about the wall. And we see the wall here in this moment of emotional, it's kind of an emotional transformative moment for Shevek. It's not the climax. We're only 60% of the way through the novel. But it's the key transformation where he realizes actually Uras is ugly and actually Anaris is beautiful. Beautiful in a more profound way. Why is it beautiful? He says we have the splendor of the human spirit that you can see in the eyes. And now we're going to look at some passages where we go back to Anaris and we see evidence of the splendor of the human spirit in his relationship to Takvar. We're going to see that human spirit play out. And that human spirit is ultimately going to draw him back. It's going to draw him back to Anaris. And notice the word he uses. He uses the word free. He says, our men and women are free. That was the question at the very beginning, right? She asked the question in the opening passage, is Anaris truly free or not? We saw the word free recur when he met Takver. He felt a true freedom. And now he realizes here in this moment that actually they are free on Anaris and the people of Uras are not free. It's so beautiful also because obviously, our society, and I don't want to talk too much about the present, but our society is obviously more like Uras than like Anaris, especially since the fall of the Soviet Union. The kind of anarchist collective communal world that is depicted on Anaris feels like history, feels like something from another time period, another zeitgeist that no longer exists. And Uras, in our world, has won, right? The world of capitalism, the world of property ownership and possession. And that makes the beauty that he associates with Anaris, the freedom that he associates with Anaris, so much more profound for us as readers, I think, because we know that that doesn't exist here in our world. That our world is like Uras. We are like these people at this party. He's yelling at us as much as he's yelling at them. And the wall, my God, don't we feel the wall in our lives sometimes? The wall in our eyes, the wall in our hearts, that we feel this wall separating us from other people. Implicitly, then, what is he saying? Where has the wall broken down? The wall has broken down on Anaris between people like him and Takver. That's where there is no wall. On Uras, here, he realizes the wall is everywhere. The novel began with him essentially crossing that wall that she describes, getting on the spaceship, coming to Uras, and what he realizes is actually the wall is still here inside everyone he looks at, this metaphorical wall. And by contrast, the real place where there was no wall, the real place where there was freedom, was back home on Anaris. So now he is going to realize, essentially, that he needs to go back. This is essentially the big pivot of the novel. But he doesn't go back immediately. Because, the real big climactic moment is, there's a whole kind of revolutionary subplot that happens on Uras. I'm not going to get too much into that. There's even a nice little moment where he has a personal revelation about time, right? Towards, a few chapters later, he kind of solves the question that's been plaguing him, right? Essentially, he figures out his research. He figures out the truth about time. Let's look at this moment just very briefly. Again, I don't want to dip too much into the theoretical and abstract discussions of time. I'm not an expert in Einstein and physics, and so there's probably levels of complexity that are way beyond me when it comes to what his revelation is. The central question is he's trying to prove this hypothesis about the coexistence of linear time and simultaneous time, right? Time as a linear kind of path, right? From X to Y or whatever, right? Time as a linear path versus time as something that occurs simultaneously. He's trying to reconcile these two ideas of time. And on page 261, he has this revelation. He had been groping and grabbing after certainty, as if it were something he could possess. He had been demanding a security, a guarantee, which is not granted, and which, if granted, would become a prison. By simply assuming the validity of real coexistence, He was left free to use the lovely geometries of relativity, and then it would be possible to go ahead. The next step was perfectly clear. The coexistence of succession could be handled by a Sabin transformation series. Thus approached, successivity and presence offered no antithesis at all. The fundamental unity of the sequency and the simultaneity points of view became plain. The concept of interval served to connect the static and the dynamic aspect of the universe. How could he have stared at reality for 10 years and not seen it? There would be no trouble at all in going on. Indeed, he had already gone on. He was there. He saw all that was to come in this first, seemingly casual glimpse of the method, given him by his understanding of a failure in the distant past. The wall was down. The vision was both clear and whole. What he saw was simple, simpler than anything else. It was simplicity, and contained in it all complexity, all promise. It was revelation. It was the way clear, the way home, the light. So we don't have to get too much into kind of what he realizes, because it's quite complicated. It'll take a long time to discuss and describe, but it has to do with, he kind of reconciles the two ideas and understandings of time and kind of accepts them both. And the result is the wall was down. Now here is another metaphorical wall. This is different from the wall that he described earlier in the people's eyes in Uras. I think the wall here is the wall between the two ideas of time, in a way between the two timelines that we've been reading, right? The present timeline on Uras and the past timeline on Anaris. The wall between those two timelines is now down, and that allows him to reach this kind of conclusion, this revelation, this simplicity. He essentially figures out and answers his question. Now, what I like about this moment is Le Guin is focusing more on the emotion that Shevek is experiencing rather than on the intellectual side, right? There is, it took me a few readings, I think, of this little section to understand essentially what he really discovered from a time perspective, right? From the perspective of relativity. More important, though, is his emotional arc, and that's what I want to focus on here. I'm less interested in the abstract, theoretical time analysis. There's lots of great essays that have been written about this novel that dive into that. And, I want to spend the time on this podcast focusing more on Shevek's emotions. So at this point, we've seen him at his lowest point when he made that big speech about the wall on Uras. And now, though, he comes through the other side and he realizes the truth. The wall comes down. And in a way, like I said, I think it's the wall between the past and the present. And so it allows him then to know what to do next. And I think, like, implicitly, after this moment, he is able to figure out the next step, figure out what to do, and eventually find his way back home, back to Anaris, which is where the novel ends. But before we get there, we have one more great section that I want to look at. So in the next chapter, so after he has this revelation, this is on page 300. So the next chapter, chapter 10, we have a chapter back on Anaris, right? Continuing the past storyline. And this is where I really found his relationship with Takvar is really at its most beautiful. So in the context, right, they have been separated for a long time because they've been assigned different jobs. They've been separated for 4 years, and he comes back to her. And it's a very profound and beautiful moment because, again, we've already set up and established that she is his soulmate, right? She is the one for him. And it's really moving to see him come back to her. And let's look at this section of them reuniting. This is on page 299, actually. They went back to domicile 8, room 3, and there their long desire was fulfilled. They did not even light the lamp. They both liked making love in darkness. Again, darkness, but it's a different darkness now. It's not the darkness he felt when he gave his long speech at the party. That was a really ugly darkness. This is a beautiful darkness. This is the darkness of his relationship with Takver, the sort of ashy, beautiful darkness that he associated with her. The first time they both came as Shevek came into her. The second time they struggled and cried out in a rage of joy, prolonging their climax as if delaying the moment of death. The third time they were both half asleep and circled about the center of infinite pleasure, about each other's being, like planets circling blindly, quietly, in the flood of sunlight, about the common center of gravity, swinging, circling endlessly. That's one of the most beautiful descriptions of lovemaking, of sex, that I've read in a novel. Earlier, remember, sex on Anaris was associated with mere pleasure, right? Just with pleasure. And then on Uras, his desire for Via is also purely sexual, purely about property and possession and pleasure. This is the exact opposite of that. Here, he and Takver are in love in what I think Le Guin wants us to see is the ideal way. This is the ideal way to be in love, right? They are circling each other, right? Climaxing together multiple times. What is the description? Circled about the center of infinite pleasure, right? In a novel that's partly all about time and the experience of time, she's basically saying their pleasure has become infinite. They've found a way to stop time. Right, the whole tension in Shevik's own research is about this question of sequence versus simultaneity, these two ideas of time. He reached this revelation in the present storyline, where he understood how to move past that contradiction. Now, in the past storyline, he and Takver also reach an answer. They also find a way to resolve that tension through this lovemaking. And what is the imagery that Ursula K. Le Guin uses to describe them? They're like planets circling each other. I mean, it's so beautiful because that's what Anaris and Uras are, right? They are circling each other. They are heavenly bodies. They are planets circling each other. And here we have the same thing, right? Planets circling blindly, quietly in the flood of sunlight, swinging, circling endlessly. It's such a beautifully written passage. The rhythm of the line itself also seems to echo this infinite circularity, right? This endless circularity, this swinging, circling movement. You feel it and hear it in the rhythms of the sentences. And then we get this next passage right after. Takver woke at dawn. She leaned on her elbow and looked across Shevek at the gray square of the window, and then at him. He lay on his back, breathing so quietly that his chest scarcely moved, his face thrown back a little, remote and stern in the thin light. So, really interesting moment where we leave Shevek's perspective and we are now in Takver's perspective. So this is one of the rare instances where we're in her head, and she's describing him. So why? Why are we in Takver's point of view now? Well, the previous passage, they just made love, they circled endlessly about each other. It's almost as if Le Guin is saying they have become one. Their perspectives have joined together. They have become one. They have joined together. The wall has come down. There are so many metaphorical walls here, and one wall is the wall between them, the wall between Takver and Shevek, the wall between two people. What a beautiful way of depicting the wall coming down, then to transition from one point of view to another, to show us Takver's point of view, because through their lovemaking, as if they've become each other, their points of view have mingled together, have shifted. I think it's so profound and so beautiful, and if we keep reading, we came, Takver thought, from a great distance to each other. We have always done so. Over great distances, over years, over abysses of chance. It is because he comes from so far away that nothing can separate us. Nothing, no distances, no years can be greater than the distance that's already between us, the distance of our sex, the difference of our being, our minds, that gap, that abyss which we bridge with a look, with a touch, with a word, the easiest thing in the world. Look how far away he is, asleep. Look how far away he is. He always is. But he comes back. He comes back. He comes back. That passage, so profound, and the reason is, there's a lot going on there, but one thing that I really like is, Takver is saying, right, we came from a great distance to each other. We have always done so. So she's talking, obviously, about what happened in this past storyline, right? They were apart for 4 years, and they came back together. But she is also talking about how he is going to come back from Uras to her, because time has now collapsed in on itself. Because Shevek has had his revelation about time, and now Takver seems to know that he will always come back. This is sort of, this is towards the end of the novel. It's not the very end, but it's towards the end. And I think it's Le Guin's way of telling us through this scene, Shevek will come back to Takvar at the end. Now, what's interesting is at the very end of the novel, we don't see them reunite. We don't actually see them reunite when he comes back to Anaris. And I sort of wonder why not. And I realized it's because this is the scene where they're reuniting. Because time is no longer important. Time does not matter. What happened in the past is not just in the past, but also in the present and the future. So this reunion that they experience in the past is implicitly the same reunion that they will experience in the future, right? The same feeling. He will always come back, as she says. No distances, no years can be greater than the distance that's already between us. What does she mean by that, right? There's a sexual difference between them, right? The difference of their sex, the difference of their being, the difference of their minds, right? By being two people, again, think of the images of walls, right? By being two people, there is a natural wall that exists between them, and she's saying they have crossed that wall, that gap, that abyss, which we bridge with a look, with a touch, with a word. They have crossed the gap between two beings, right? Between two minds. They've become one person. And that tells her that no matter how far away he is, he will always come back. This is her way of telling us, the readers, he will come back. And it's such a beautiful, I think so beautiful, and again, it's why I believe that Takver is one of the most important characters in the novel, because she represents the emotional foundation that draws him back to Anaris. If we jump ahead a little bit, right, in this same chapter on page 311, so jumping ahead, right, this whole chapter is kind of about the two of them and kind of thinking and deciding. This is when he makes the decision to leave, basically, the decision to leave Anaris for Uras. Only now that decision doesn't feel tragic or sad, but there's an optimism to it because Takver essentially tells him, I know you will be back, right? Even though he feels uncertain about it, she gives him her blessing because she says, I know you will come back. She is so confident that he will come back that she is okay with him leaving. And we also feel that confidence because we have now experienced the novel and we know that he will come back. We understand what she understands. On page 311, though, he's reflecting on his relationship with Takver. He says, so his mutual commitment with Takver, their relationship, had remained thoroughly alive during their 4 years' separation. They had both suffered from it, and suffered a good deal. But it had not occurred to either of them to escape the suffering by denying the commitment. For after all, he thought now, lying in the warmth of Takver's sleep, it was joy they were both after, the completeness of being. If you evade suffering, you also evade the chance of joy. Pleasure you may get, or pleasures, but you will not be fulfilled. You will not know what it is to come home. Takver sighed softly in her sleep, as if agreeing with him, and turned over, pursuing some quiet dream. So what does he mean by this, right? He's saying essentially that the separation between him and Takver was necessary because it was suffering that they experienced, right? It was suffering, but it led them to this profound joy, to this completeness of being. So he's talking about his relationship with Takver, but remember, Takver is also a symbol of Anaris. She is also a representation in some ways. She's connected to the planet. He's also talking about life on Anaris. He's saying, yes, there is suffering here. There is suffering, but that suffering leads to joy. And implicitly he's saying on Uras, because there is no suffering, there is no joy. The people of Uras, they don't know what it is to come home. He knows what it is to come home because he has just come back to Takver. And we're going to see him come back home, or we're going to see him make the decision to come back home again at the very end of the novel. He's going to come back one more time, back to Anaris, back home. And we implicitly understand that he's going to feel this profound joy because that's what he's realizing here. There's actually one section I want to go back to. Back on page 300, this was a section we skipped over, but it's a beautiful, I think, description. It's actually my favorite description of the novel. For whatever reason, this one stuck out more than anything else. And it's just the description of him and Takvar at peace together. This is on page 301. The days were utterly peaceful, in the autumn sunlight, in the silence of the hills. It was to Shevek a time outside time, beside the flow, unreal, enduring, enchanted. He and Takver sometimes talked very late. Other nights they went to bed, not long after dark, and slept 9 hours, 10 hours, in the profound, crystalline silence of the mountain night. I love that description because that phrase, the profound, crystalline silence of the mountain night, it's a perfect description of what we talked about earlier, that cold beauty of Anaris. Yes, it is dusty and dirty and dark and difficult to live in and arid, but it has a crystalline silence. It is profound. And they feel at peace, and more importantly, they feel like they have escaped time. Right? He literally says it was a time outside time. Unreal, enduring, enchanted. If this novel is about attempting, if one theme of this novel is about Shevek trying to reconcile these two ideas of time, he succeeded here. He and Takvar together have succeeded. They have escaped time. And the chapter ends, if we look at the very last paragraph of this chapter, it ends with a return to this same idea. He says, "So looking back on the last 4 years, Shevek saw them not as wasted, but as part of the edifice that he and Takver were building with their lives. The thing about working with time instead of against it, he thought, is that it is not wasted. Even pain counts." It's a very beautiful climactic moment. I would say it's the kind of emotional climax. So that chapter, I believe, is the emotional climax of the novel. It's not the literal climax. There's still a little bit more to go, but it is the emotional climax because we see Shevek reach this moment of profound peace. With Takver, he has realized how to escape time and how to achieve true joy and true freedom. We go back to the beginning. What was the tension and the question Le Guin set up at the beginning? It was, is Anaris truly a free society? Her answer is clearly yes, it is. And we've seen Shevek reach that point through his arc of the novel. And this chapter really summarizes where he ends up. So again, if we think about character arc, which I think is the most beautiful thing about this novel is the wonderful character arc that Le Guin depicts, the character arc of Shevek. He begins the novel anxious and unhappy, right? He leaves Anaris, he crosses the wall, he comes to Uras, he's a fish out of water, he's struggling. We also see him struggling on Anaris in the flashbacks, right? He has this moment of crisis, and he has, as a result, this change, this pivot in the middle of the novel. Meeting Takvar obviously changes something for him, but also the profound ugliness that he realizes exists on Uras changes something for him. And when he has that kind of revelation about time, then he is able to transform, and we see evidence of that transformation, that emotional transformation, in this chapter, in chapter 10, right? The chapter where he and Takver reunite in the past. And implicitly, it is a kind of like model for how they're going to reunite in the future, right? Because they have now stepped outside of time through their love. And it returns to my original point. Takver is the second most important character in this novel because she is the emotional foundation that anchors him to Anaris and that enables him to reach personal fulfillment and joy and freedom and meaning. Now, the last passage I want to look at, if we just look at the end, right? I'm not going to look at everything, right, in these final chapters, but there is one more really beautiful passage kind of towards the very end of the novel. So this is in chapter 13, right? It's where he's on a spaceship, basically going back to Anaris. And it's this very enigmatic and very beautiful little moment that I want to look at. So it's right at the end. He's on the ship. He's going back to Anaris. He's going back home. Very late on the following ship night, Shevek was in the Devenant's garden. The lights were out there, and it was illuminated only by starlight. The air was quite cold. A night-blooming flower from some unimaginable world had opened among the dark leaves and was sending out its perfume with patient, unavailing sweetness to attract some unimaginable moth trillions of miles away in a garden on a world circling another star. The sunlights differ, but there is only one darkness. So this is such an interesting image, right? Why this flower? I was really fascinated when I read it. I was trying to kind of make sense of it because the idea is this is clearly a flower from some other world, right? Because he's on a spaceship belonging to some other race of people who are bringing him back to Anaris. Why this flower? I think it's just a really interesting symbol, a really interesting image of, I believe it's meant to be Shevek himself, right? He is the flower. Because remember, this whole novel, he has been outside of his own world. He's been kind of this fish out of water. He has been on Uras, away from home. Very much like this flower. The flower is also away from home. And it's sending out its perfume with patient, unavailing sweetness. Why is it sending out this perfume? It's trying to attract a moth that's trillions of miles away. Because the idea is whatever world this flower came from, it's trillions of miles away. The moth that this flower wants to attract is trillions of miles away. In a garden on a world circling another star. I think it's just an image of loneliness, of isolation, of separation. He sees this flower longing for this moth, right? Releasing this perfume to try and call for this moth who is not going to come because it's so far away. It's a very sad image, this lonely, isolated flower. And then right after that, right, he looks out at the planet, he looks out at Anaris, and then he thinks of Takver. So I think he is the flower, only he is going home. He is the flower, but he is also different from the flower because the flower is far away from home. It is calling to a moth, right? The moth, if he is the flower, then the moth is Takver. He's calling to a moth. Implicitly, the flower and the moth will not reunite, but Shevek will because Shevek is going home. So I think this flower is this final image of loneliness and isolation. And this time, because Shevek is returning home, it's kind of a contrast to who he is. It's this final kind of sad image of something isolated and something alone, but it's no longer who Shevek is. He is no longer this flower. He has returned home. And implicitly, he will be with Takver again. He will be with his moth again. And I think it's just a beautiful image towards the very last pages of the novel for Le Guin to conclude on. And so, for us to conclude here, right, what is the power of this novel? Why do I find this novel so moving? Perhaps it's for different reasons than other people do. I know this novel is extremely popular, and Le Guin is an extremely popular writer. Everyone talks about Omelas, right, her famous short story. She is a writer who has very sophisticated ideas, right, as a lot of science fiction writers do. I understand that's the power of science fiction, but to be completely honest, I'm not that interested in the ideas. The ideas are interesting. Anarchism is interesting. I'm interested in the collective, of course, right? I am interested in politics, but those things don't move me. What moved me about this novel and why I think it is a masterpiece is she takes those ideas and she anchors them in character emotion. This is such an important lesson for us all to learn as writers. We all want to say something profound about the world. We have all these feelings and thoughts and ideas that we want to convey, and sometimes we get lost in our abstractions and we fail to really convince readers and to make an impression on readers. Le Guin was able to convince me, and I'm a skeptic of science fiction in a general sense, or at least I don't necessarily always think science fiction is as profound as other genres, but I have to admit in this case I was wrong, because this novel is a masterpiece, but it's not a masterpiece because of its ideas. It's a masterpiece because she takes those ideas and puts them in the experience of the individual. And to be honest, because she anchors them in this very beautiful and profound love story. I will think about the love story between Takver and Shevek for the rest of my life. It is one of the great love stories in all of fiction. And part of it is because of how confidently she writes, because of how confidently she uses her characters to express what she wants to say, and just how much she anchors the entire plot on the love story. How the love story between them seems to solve the crisis in Shevek's heart. And that's why it is so beautiful, and that's why it is so profound. And so I think the lesson we can take from this, whether we're writers, whether we're readers, is when we write, when we have these great ideas can be powerful, sure, but human feeling is more powerful. We have to take those ideas and we have to place them in the emotional core and soul of our characters. When we ask this question of stakes in a novel, ideas by themselves can have stakes, but those stakes will never be as powerful as the stakes of the human soul. And the reason this novel works so well is that Le Guin knows that, and she makes sure that we feel what Shevek feels first and foremost, and that allows us to experience his ideas. Without the sort of emotional stakes of his journey, none of this would be as meaningful or as powerful. And perhaps that's where other sci-fi novels fail, where they sort of resort to an emotional coldness and sterility in the face of what they think are profound ideas. But as Le Guin understands, you cannot have profound ideas with emotional sterility. Profound ideas are profound because they are anchored in human emotion. And that's what she does so well here. All right, so once again, thank you all for listening. As always, if you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, and share the podcast. And I will see you all next time.